Ismail and Dr. Abdulhakim to help us understand both the spiritual and the counseling angle for how to help raise boys to become men, inshallah. So without further ado, Dr. Suzy Ismail uh, has her company called Cornerstone. She's going to help us a little bit introduce Cornerstone. Cornerstone is a Zakat partner for MCGP. We are very impressed and very inspired, very grateful for the services that she's helped our clients with in the past and most recently as well. And Dr. Abdulrahman has his PhD from University of Medina, Notre Dame, with several decades of experience. And we're very fortunate that he's one of two visiting scholars for MCGP. And he will be with us, inshallah, for an extended period of time, hopefully through Ramadan as well. This would be one of his first lectures on Friday evenings. And he's also doing Jummah and Fajr halakas and post-Isha halakas. So please come on site to enjoy and inspire and learn from him as well. So without further ado, we will appreciate, inshallah, if Dr. Abdulrahman make a small starting dua, and then...
I'm not Abdulrahman, I'm Abdulhakim.
Abdulhakim, sorry. I'll keep confusing you. Dr. Abdulhakim could make a small starting dua, and Dr. Suzy will start after that. Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحابته ومن والاه. اللهم بارك لنا في هذه الجلسة يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعل فيما نقول خيرا لديننا ودنيانا وعاقبة أمرنا. اللهم ثبتنا بالقول واحلل عقدة من ألسنتنا وافتح قلوب الناس إلى ما نقول من الحق واغفر لنا زلاتنا وأخطائنا إنك سميع مجيب الدعوات. تفضل عبد الرحمن. Dr. Suzy, you can start.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to the MCGP community, the MCGP volunteers, the organizers, Brother Parvez and the board for putting together this incredibly important program. I had hoped to join everyone in person at the masjid. It was exciting to hear that we're slowly starting to, begin on-site programming. And inshallah, I'm praying that this is an opening, the faraj that we've been waiting for, that we can gather hopefully again in person, inshallah, and connect in person as well. And although I wasn't able to physically be there, I'm happy we have this platform to connect in other ways through Zoom and through the webinars. So, in putting together this program today, talking about our boys, our sons, our brothers, those who will grow up to be the husbands of our daughters, that will be the fathers of their own children, I think it's an incredibly timely topic and a topic that we don't often talk about enough. We talk a lot about spiritual elements. We talk about parenting in a general sense. We talk about, how do we build communities and how do we improve ourselves? But really talking specifically about our boys, this is a critical component of being able to move forward. I know our communities were touched with tragedy this past week or so, several tragedies that, so many families experienced. But, two tragedies in particular come to mind, tragedies that touched our communities, that touched families, and they're tragedies that honestly, in our work that we do at Cornerstone, we see consistently, a loss of lives, and whether it's a loss of life physically, in losing a life because of one ending their own life, or a loss of life to addiction, a loss of life to losing the deen, a loss of life because of losing the will to live. We're seeing this consistently, and we're seeing it primarily and more frequently among boys between the ages of 12 and 21. And it's really concerning because when we start to see a trend happening within our communities, within our families, that's the area that we know needs more explanation, more exploration, and more understanding. And what we're seeing consistently now is this sense of loss that's happening, particularly among the boys within our communities. And we're going to focus on the Muslim community, but we're seeing it as a trend across communities and across, faiths. So what's happening to our boys? What is going on? And again, we see this not just at those young years, but we see that the problems that are being experienced by boys at the early years, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, we see them perpetuated even later on into married life and when they become fathers themselves. So to break this cycle, we do need to better understand what's happening, and we need to better understand how we as a community, we as parents, we as educators can get involved, and how, hopefully, I know a few people had asked me earlier whether or not this is a talk or a conversation that their boys could attend. And, my response was yes, bring your boys to attend a program, even if we're concentrating more on the parenting perspective, having the boys listen and understand that they are important, they are valued, they are a topic of conversation, they are important enough for the masjid to put together a program to talk about how do we raise our boys into men, and how do we guide them in a way that is best to them, pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal, and best for them in dunya and akhirah, inshallah. So, I know for most of us, this morning or late last night, we follow the ritual, that becomes part of our homes of reading Surah Al-Kahf, reciting Surah Al-Kahf from Friday to Friday. And subhanAllah, every time, we listen to the recitation of Surah Al-Kahf, we take something from it, and this is why the beauty of listening to it or reciting it week after week carries so much weight for us. And subhanAllah, this morning when I was listening to Surah Al-Kahf, what really spoke to me and caught me was really reflecting on, what happened in the description of the young men who enter into the cave. What happened? What pushed them towards the cave? And how is this a reflection of what we're seeing today in our communities as well? In Surah Al-Kahf, we see that we're reminded that there are these young men who faced, hardship, who faced a situation in which they wanted to get closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. They wanted to be protected from the fitna that is around them. And so what did they do? In their love of Allah, in their love of the monotheistic faith, they sought refuge by finding a cave, finding a place of seclusion. And this is a theme that we see consistently in our deen. We see it, when Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was trying to find his faith, when he would question and sit and reflect for hours saying, could this be my God? Could this be my God? We see it in, this right before the pandemic. I was blessed, alhamdulillah, to take a Umrah trip and to help lead a group. And it was my first time actually climbing up Jabal Rahma and praying in Ghar Hira. And subhanAllah, being up there thinking about the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and how he sought seclusion in that ghar, in that cave, in order to turn away from the fitna, to reflect and to try to get closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, why was I reflecting on all of this, in listening to Surah Al-Kahf this morning? Because I just kept thinking, where do our boys find their seclusion? Where do our boys who are surrounded by fitna consistently, who are surrounded by pornography, who are surrounded by addictions, who are surrounded by marijuana, who are surrounded by, a multitude of things that are being thrown at them, where do they go to find their seclusion? And instead of, as in Surah Al-Kahf, turning to that place of seclusion in terms of reflecting upon Allah Azza wa Jal, because of the distractions, because of what surrounds us, we see our children, boys and girls, turning away towards that, unfortunately, which secludes them from the family, but doesn't necessarily remove them from the fitna. So we find them immersing themselves in their cell phones. We find them immersing themselves in the video games. We find them immersing themselves in, in their bedrooms. How many of us and how many parents have spoken to me, particularly during this pandemic, where they say, I can't get my child to leave his bedroom anymore because he's in there taking Zoom classes all day long. And then he says he has homework and there's no quiet space, and that's the only space that they have. But far from being a cave of reflection, far from being a place of seclusion where the heart can find ease, what we're finding instead is in those places of seclusion, our boys are turning to that which makes their heart find less rest, not more rest, that which causes them to be more unsettled. And this is where we start to see the difficulty, that the outlets that our boys are looking for are not available. And we've seen it increased, so many times during this pandemic as well, as that virtual world is sucking us in, as we saw sports being, removed, as we saw, school and the gatherings in school no longer happening, as we saw our masajid, closing their doors, and our children who maybe would have that social outlet, that was the time they would get out of their room, no longer having access to it. And so we see that seclusion began to push our children, and again, we're seeing it very much so with our young men, with our boys, into a place of negative and self-destructive thoughts. And those negative and self-destructive thoughts are not something that just happen overnight, but we're seeing the planted seeds of the negative and the self-destructive thoughts starting very early on. So where do we see it? Where do we see these seeds planted? There's a great book, and I strongly recommend anyone who has boys, who has sons, anyone who is an educator, anyone who is a leader in the community, read this book. It's called Boys Adrift by Dr. Leonard Sachs. And it's a great book because Leonard Sachs, he is conservative in his faith. He's not Muslim, but he takes the faith-based approach, essentially, in terms of better understanding what is happening to our boys and why are we losing them? Because we are losing them. And we're losing them, like I said, we see that loss not just in high school or college years. We see it carry over even in marriages. And so when we start to question and say, what's happening in our marriages? Why are they not succeeding? Yes, we can have a whole other discussion about women and what's happening to our girls, but we see a significant impact on what's happening in the early years of raising our boys in terms of what's being affected later on as well. So in the book, Boys Adrift, Dr. Sachs talks about 5 different factors, and I want to explore those factors with you today to help us get a better understanding of what's happening, and then to tackle that what's happening, not just with why, to understand it, but with how we're going to face it. What are we going to do about it? So he talks about the first factor that impacts our boys is changes in school culture. What is happening in our schools? For many of us who maybe, grew up in the 80s or, went to school, I remember back in the 80s, in the early 80s, it was very common for there to be fights, in the playground, after school all the time. During lunchtime, there wouldn't be a day that would pass without somebody getting beaten up. And I'm not in any way promoting violence. I'm not saying that this is a positive, but that was a natural part of what we would see growing up. And then as years passed, into the early 90s, we began to hear the no-touch rule, we began to hear the keep your hands to yourself, which is, of course, a very positive perspective in trying to teach children alternate ways to deal with problems other than with physical ramifications. But the problem was the alternatives were never offered. So the no-touch rule was implemented, but the raging hormones of children, the misunderstandings, the difficulty, the frustration was not given another outlet. So while the children were being told, no, make sure that you don't touch, make sure that you don't fight, which again, positive messages that we want to teach our children, the question then becomes, where does that frustration go? Where does that energy, be released? And so without giving the alternative, we began to see among boys, and we continue to see this in our school systems, a sense of frustration that's stifled, a sense of frustration where there's an inability to know where the outlet is. Now, remember, we talked about the seclusion and the self-reflection. When the seclusion is disturbed by constant, elements being thrown at a child, whether they're online elements or images or things that they're receiving on their phones, that there is no seclusion. And if that seclusion and self-reflection isn't happening, that tazkiyat an-nafs that we're all striving for, if we're not able to guide our children towards that, then what outlet do they have to deal with all of the emotions, the frustrations that happen with the hormonal fluctuations that occur in those middle school years? We also see a shift in school culture in terms of, for anyone who's an educator out there, you're probably familiar with VARC, the idea of how children learn. And we know that children can learn visually, they can learn orally, meaning from hearing, they can learn in a reading perspective, they can learn kinesthetically through movement. Now, studies show that most boys in the elementary, middle school, and even high school level tend to rank higher on the kinesthetic level of learning. Meaning, in order to learn, they need to move. In order to learn, they need to touch. In order to learn, they need to have an interaction that goes beyond simply just the visual. And we see that many girls tend to score higher on the visual and the reading. And so what's happening today, and we see it definitely in the pandemic, we've got our children who are, locked behind screens, our boys who may be kinesthetic learners not being able to learn kinesthetically, our boys who are even within classrooms, being told to sit in their chairs and don't get up, but they've got this kinesthetic energy that they're not able to release. And the comparisons, Dr. Sachs has also written a book called Gender Matters, and he talks about the comparisons and the differences between the biology of the female and the male. And what we're seeing today, and it's another very disturbing trend, of course, that we're seeing within our Muslim community as well, the push for gender non-conformity, the push for a gender non-binary approach, meaning girls and boys are the same, that we shouldn't differentiate between a girl and a boy. And this is why we're seeing so many young people who are, gravitating toward, don't call me he, don't call me she, use they, right? That's my pronoun. And, for many of us, we're starting to see a rise of this, of the identification of pronouns. But what's really happening is we're trying to neutralize gender. And we see within so many schools now, out in California, in New York, in Colorado, I know they've implemented it, the gender-bread curriculum, which is a curriculum that's designed to neutralize gender, to say girls and boys are exactly the same. We can't differentiate between gender. But we know that Allah Azza wa Jal has not created us in that way, and that we do respond differently as males and females. But when we start creating this sense of there is no differentiation between the male and the female, what happens? It leaves our boys lost. It leaves them wondering, how do they find their path? What are their cues? And so when we try to introduce role models to our sons, when we try to teach them the seerah of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when we try to teach them about Umar and Ali and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhum, our children are lost. Our boys are lost because they don't see this role model behavior within their school systems. They don't see it on the television shows that they watch. They don't see it online. When we watch, when we turn the television on, if you're watching something on Disney, invariably the fathers tend to be these bumbling, awkward, often overweight fathers who really, are the laughing stocks of the show, And a lot of times what we're seeing now with this shift in terms of gender normalcy, we're seeing, the women being showcased. And again, this can be beautiful if it is formed in a fair way, but the women being showcased as strong, as articulate, as being able to excel. But somewhere in the path when we were focusing so hard on our girls, focusing on developing, STEM programs for females, focusing on promoting women, we've lost sight of the fact that our boys have gotten lost in the system, that our boys don't know who they are anymore. They don't have an identity to anchor themselves to, because all they hear in their schools is that, you have to be quiet, you have to sit still, you have to listen, you have to read. And these may not be the best learning avenues or the learning paths that we see among males as they're growing up. We also see it, if we're to look to our school systems, the percentage of female teachers, and, even if we're to glance to our Islamic schools, the percentage of female teachers far outweighs the percentage of male teachers. The first role models that our children are seeing outside of the home as males are females. And again, while this can be a beautiful reminder of the way that Allah Azza wa Jal has created males and females differently, but with each their own strengths, Instead, a lot of times we're seeing confusion and we're seeing difficulty in identifying with the male gender and understanding what the male gender actually looks like and what it means to be a male. And this is why, on college campuses, so often, when we talk about the verse in the Quran, الرجال قوامون على النساء, right? The men are the protectors and the providers over the women. There is such a pushback that I see from women, young women, college age women, women who are about to get married, when it comes to this verse. Why? Because we've equated the concept of protection and providing, from the male perspective, to be something that is negative, that a female doesn't need to be protected, a female doesn't need to be provided for. But, the hikmah of Allah Azza wa Jal tells us that each of us, male and female, has our roles. But again, what path are we giving to our boys? Another element of the 5 factors that Dr. Sachs talks about that he says are affecting our boys and causing them to be adrift is our video games. And, not just video games, but video games and the access to pornography. When we talk about what our boys are seeing and what they're exposed to, we've seen that in video games such as, the video game Fortnite. Anyone who has a middle school boy, probably went through a bit of a Fortnite stage with the child. We see that the creators of the game Fortnite actually studied for years the way that a gambler becomes addicted to gambling. And they began to understand, what is it about the game, the card game, the poker game, the, whatever it is, the slot machines, that causes a gambler to continue to go back over and over again. And upon studying the action of the gambler, the creators of Fortnite followed the same elements of reward within the brain patterns to create this game. And this is why so many of our boys in particular are addicted to the video game. Because remember that ghar, that cave that we talked about, that outlet, that wanting to find a way to escape. When there is no healthy alternative, then the escape can be an unhealthy one, and it can be an addiction, whether it's a video game addiction or a pornography addiction. And the pornography addictions work very much the same. We know that it's a monetized situation. So that clickbait, clicking on one image and then being pulled deeper and deeper into another image and another image. And these are images that show up where? They're links that show up when, you're checking the scores for the football game. They're links that show up when you want to see which basketball team is playing tonight, and very much targeted at our youth. And it becomes a very slippery slope because it becomes a form of escape. So being aware and recognizing and understanding the impact also that the video games have, or the pornography has, on desensitization, shifting the way that a child sees gender and humanity, so that when the pornography is viewed in the child's mind, kind of reaches on or latches on to the image there of what they are seeing as the female role and the male role, that causes severe damage to the psyche and to their understanding of their own role. The same thing with video games, that perpetuation of violence and that degradation of women. When you look at the images of the way the characters are even drawn in video games today, it continues that cycle within the minds of our boys. The next factor that Dr. Sachs talks about is ADHD and the overdiagnosis of ADHD and the over-medication of ADHD. So, I'm sure many of us remember days when people would say, oh, boys will be boys, right? And it was kind of understood what that meant, boys will be boys. Today, if you were to say boys will be boys, the meaning, it's devoid of meaning, because we no longer understand, what does that mean, boys will be boys? And that concept of toxic masculinity, the male who cannot be soft and cannot cry, because if the male cries, then this shows weakness. But the male also cannot be aggressive and cannot, be moving too much and cannot be active or cannot be not focused. Then this is also a problem. And so what's being consistently diagnosed as ADHD, and again, it's a super interesting chapter in his book when he talks about the overdiagnosis. I think we need to take time, and this is not to dismiss the fact that ADHD does exist and it is a problem, but we want to be careful in terms of overdiagnosis and understanding why are we seeing so many more cases of ADHD today as opposed to what we've seen in the past. We also see environmental factors, what is happening around our children? What are our boys seeing in school, at home, on the computer? What are they exposed to on a daily basis, and who are they interacting with? And this can impact, of course, how they see themselves. And the final factor, so we said it's the changes in the school structure. We said video games, ADHD, overdiagnosis, environmental impacts. He also talks a bit about, the environmental impacts, for example, things that are in plastics, hormones that are in food, and the way that affects testosterone. Again, that's a very scientific chapter that I think it's worth reading though. And the final factor that's talked about is the devaluation of masculinity. The fact that the male role models, again, cease to exist for many of our children, because we can teach them about the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we can teach them about the Sahaba, but it seems so distant for so many of them. When they don't have a mentor that they have access to, then it becomes difficult for them to see themselves as something that's elevated, something to strive for. And in many cases, we're dealing with homes where there are single mothers raising their boys alone. We're dealing with homes where there are fathers who are part of the household, but I'm kind of putting in air quotes, only part of the household, but not visible, not interactive, not hands-on with their children. We're seeing homes in which fathers are not the role models that our children need. And so this is a huge impact with the identity as well, that how does a child see themselves if those around him are not giving the example that they need to see to be the best person that they can be. And a lot of times what goes hand in hand with all of these 5 factors is a lack of control, a feeling of uncertainty, not knowing how to be who you're meant to be, being pulled in so many different directions by society, by your family, by the community, by your faith even, and not feeling like you can measure up. And that drop in self-esteem is something that we are seeing consistently, that increases elements of depression, that increases clinical anxiety, and that has caused so much loss of hope among our boys and our young men. And this is problematic because it goes back to identity. When a child looks in the mirror, who do they see? What are they identifying about themselves? How do they connect or disconnect with who they are? And something that we're seeing quite frequently among our boys today as well is something that's known as social dysphoria. The idea that society has these definitions of what it means to be a boy, and that the male, the child, doesn't know how to achieve these definitions. And again, there's a lot of conflicting definitions out there that our children struggle with. And so in guiding them through social dysphoria, again, a lot of times what winds up happening is that a child who is questioning, who am I? And what does this mean for me? Or how do I act? Can also question gender. And along with the questioning of gender, with things such as the gender-bred curriculum or, the LGBTQIA plus push that we're seeing, our children are getting sucked into this idea of gender neutrality, gender non-conformity, gender non-binary approaches. And that is deeply affecting our youth. So what do we do about it? We didn't even touch marijuana, drugs, alcohol abuse. We haven't touched really issues of sexuality and, connections with people in school or people with the opposite gender, people with the same gender. We haven't talked about friends. All of these are our pots. And I want you to imagine that in each of these pots is the social factors or the systems that interact, that affect the child and that affect the way that the child grows. So what do we do, as parents, as community educators, as, leaders who are worried about our children and their future? What do? We start by unpacking the pots. We start by looking at all of the elements that affect our children, all of the elements that affect our boys. So we talked about finding a place, a refuge essentially from that fitna. Where is that refuge? It may not be in the masjid. And as much as that breaks our heart because we want our children to have hearts that are attached to the masjid, we do need to be realistic and recognize that when, a child's friends are all going out to hang out, in, I don't know, a movie theater or hang out and going roller skating. I don't know if anybody roller skates anymore, going to the mall or just hanging out and, on their computers. And we're telling our child, no, you have to go to the masjid. We also need to create a safe space. Maybe it's going to be, hiking. Maybe it's going to be taking a camping trip. Maybe it's going to be including those that surround our children that can be the best of influences, but finding those alternatives for that sense of seclusion. Recognizing that our children are going to disappear sometimes because they're going to be trying to figure things out for themselves, but being there as well, putting some rules down, no doors closed, for example, with devices in the rooms, making sure that devices, do have parental regulations on them and parental controls, giving the alternative, having those family game nights, connecting with our children and our boys in ways where they feel loved. Because we're doing a great job, alhamdulillah, in many ways of reminding our daughters of how special they are, of how they can succeed, of how they can do anything, they put their mind to. I know all of the celebrations when our female vice president, took her position. This is something that gives a lot of women, young women, a sense of hope and a feeling of like, I can strive for that. But what are we giving our boys? What are they seeing? They're seeing presidents who are embroiled in scandals that are of sexual natures. They're seeing leaders in our countries that are corrupt. Who are we giving to our boys to look to help guide them as well? So I know I'm going a bit over time, and I feel like this is a topic that we can dive into very heavily. But again, I would say just for starters, let's take a look at those pots. Let's see what those elements are that are impacting our children. Let's look at the friends that we are surrounding our boys with. Let's look at the alternatives that we're giving them in order for them to have outlets. Let's look at their education and how they're responding to the school system. What is their VARC? What is their learning style? And does it connect for them? Let's look at how we can help them in letting out their emotions and their hormonal responses to what they may be experiencing. Let's create safe spaces for our boys as well, so that they can grow into the men that inshallah they will one day be. So I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal protects our boys, protects our girls, protects our families, and helps us guide them into that next stage of adulthood so that they can be the best that they can be, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khair.
Jazakallah, Dr. Suzy. Thank you so much. MashaAllah, that was very beautiful. Do you by any chance have the name of that book that you could either put in the chat for the attendees to be able to have that?
Yes, I'll definitely put it in the chat right now.
Jazakallah. Dr. Abdulhakim.
طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحابته ومن والاه. I wanted to thank Dr. Suzy first. Amazing presentation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you, sister. I think I'm going to go, though, a different route. Not to disagree with Dr. Suzy, but probably add more flavor to this. And I'll start with a story. A story we all know. A woman came to the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam complaining that her husband said to her, "You are to me as my mother." In Surah Al-Mumtahina, the story is well known. And the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did not have an answer for her, meaning if those verses were not revealed, she would have lost her marriage. She said a statement, and I'm going to have my talk start from there. She said a statement. She said, "Ya Rasulullah, inna li minhu iyal." I have children from him. In taraktuhum ilayhi ضاعوا وإن تركتهم إلي جاءوا. She said, "Ya Rasulullah, if I was to leave my children to their father, they will get lost. And if I was to leave them to me, they will go hungry." I want us to pay attention to the two statements. If it's left to the father, the children get lost. How so? How would our children get lost? The father is a loving parent, just like a mother. A father is actually more decisive in his decision. It's actually the father is more of a disciplinary than the mother. And most children fear their father more so than they would fear the mother. But children that are taken care of by a father usually get lost. And those who are taken care of by their mother have a better chance. Let me add to that. I want to ask you guys something. I'm going to mention a few names, and remember them. Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, and then the son of Nuh alayhi salam. Right? What happened to Isa alayhi salam? Did he go wrong? He did not. Musa, he did not. What's the common denominator between Isa and Musa? The mother. Did you read anywhere in the Quran or Sunnah any mention of a father in their lives? Now, Isa, of course, had no father, but Musa, there's no mention of the father whatsoever. But the mother was mentioned. In fact, two women shared parenting of Musa alayhi salam. His mother and the wife of Fir'aun. The male factor was there, and it was a very negative factor, extremely negative factor. It was Fir'aun, none worse than he. And the outcome of Musa is, as we know. Now, Nuh alayhi salam had a son. What happened to him? He went away. In fact, he caused so much pain for his father that his father, at a moment in lapse of mind, argued with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wanting to save him. What type of mother did he have? I guess y'all know. A mother that was not a pleasant one. In Surah Tahrim, her name and the wife of Lut were mentioned as examples of evil females. Why am I starting with this? Now, Dr. Suzy and everybody else might be looking at our youth when they become youth, because our community did suffer, like she said, with teenagers taking their lives away. But these problems really never start when they become youth. Yes, I agree that social media has its impact. I agree that schools and what's going on with the schools has its impact. I agree that our social environment is wrong. I agree with all of what was said. But the thing that I see is that's actually an outcome of what already that child has been through. He's left at a younger age to not become a man. So by the time he is a youth, a teenager, he's receptive to the negativity already. Like they say in Arabic, فَصَادَفَ قَلْبًا خَالِيًا فَتَمَكَّنَ. There was emptiness in that heart of that child, so he absorbed whatever negativity that came from the outside. The mother of Anas, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, she raised him. And she did not let him leave until he was ready to leave. She brought him to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam to finish the journey. Imam Ahmed, his mother raised him. And I don't mean fed him, I said raised him until he was ready to be on his own to travel to seek more knowledge. And when he left, he was on his own. I think what we witness today of this pandemic on our children is because we have failed our children when they're 2, 3, 4 years old. And I believe the father failed the children because he did not educate the mother enough, and the mother didn't educate herself enough to know that she is the most important factor in that child. The mother is the one that formulates and creates that conscious in that child. Our history always have said this, al-ummu madrasa. She is the school. In Adhd, if our society was to prepare our daughters to becoming righteous mothers, أعددت شعبا طيب الأعراق, then you have a beautiful society. I think our boys have failed because our girls were failed into becoming mothers. They're into professions, they're into this and that. There's no one that cares for that child. They miss that empathy because men don't have it. They miss that care, that loving care that allows them to understand and value manners, heritage, custom. What do we see in our homes today at the age of 2? I'm so shocked. What Dr. Suzy said about phones and social media is given to 2-year-olds. I would worry when they're given these devices at the age of 2 and 3, what would they find when they're at the age of 13 and 14? So a plant only shows itself after it goes through a long phase of growth underground. You put that seed, and it takes a while for that seed to come out as a plant. If you don't cater to that seed at the beginning, before it flourishes out, it dies while it's still in there. Then even if it comes out and it doesn't produce anything. Even the da'wah itself in Islam, Allah Ta'ala mentioned it like it's a plant. It needs to be nurtured. We give birth to our children and we tend to just have them get out of our way at that age. We fill their lives with toys and plays and games and, you know, go family visits or go out even picnicking and all that. But what they're doing is nothing. There's nothing planted in our children of becoming men and women in their lives. You give me anyone in history that made something of themselves, most likely it's because of their mother. I mean, subhanAllah, in Islam, an orphan is the one that loses his father, but in Yemen, we say the true orphan is the one that loses their mother. Fathers don't raise children, they feed them. Mothers do. And then fathers take over at the age when the boy no longer can associate himself with a feminine figure. Then the father comes in. That's when you need to take them to camping and hiking and all the sports and stuff, and do not leave them linger in their room. And believe me, I mean, I'm older than Dr. Suzy. She said back in the 80s, I can say back in the 70s. You take kids these days for camping, they'll love it. You take them for hiking, they'll love it. But if they have been tamed to sit in their room for the past 10 years since they were 2 or 3, why would they want to go out camping or hiking or archery or riding horses? I have a friend of mine that lives here. He takes his kids every weekend for horseback riding. They can't wait to get to Saturday to go. At the same time, they're not involved in the social media anymore, but it started with their mother. We need to find programs to educate parenting, not to mention the symptoms, but to figure out the remedy. Symptoms, we all see it. We all witness pornography today as a pandemic. We all understand that. We see that, not just with our culture, with everyone else. We see the gender being lost into non-gender, but discussions. We see some of our Muslim kids question the concept of homosexuality. These are symptoms. We need to go back and understand why these symptoms found a place within our children. It found it because from day one, we did not prepare them for this. We did not educate them. We did not teach them because we didn't have the tools to give for our mothers to provide it and breastfeed it to their children. I think what's happening, it's not the society at fault. It's homes. Dr. Suzy's right. She said, fathers are so-called there. They're so-called there not for the children. They're also so-called there for the mothers. You know, I got married 30 years ago. And the first thing I remember doing with my wife is I insisted that she has to memorize the Quran. Did everything possible until she did. If I was to be graded as a father to my children, I probably would get a D-, maybe even an E. But in reality, if I was to be graded of what I did for my children, I'd probably get an A because I helped to evolve the best mother that they can find. Because of that, I have 4 children that are father of Quran. 3 others are working their way to get there. And then the baby that's running around. I wasn't looking for her to be the best wife. I was looking at her to be the best mother. I prepared the educator for my children. And I just monitored that cycle and helped out by making sure tweaks here and there work out for her. Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the moment he was born, for the next 4 years, who took care of him? Was it his uncle, his father, his grandfather? They sent him with a woman to take care of him, not just to breastfeed him. She also raised him in an environment where men are raised. Halima as-Sa'di. Most of his troubles actually came after that, but he was prepared to live up to the challenge. You have Kulthum, Zainab, Fatima, daughters of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abdullah, Al-Qasim, Sayyid. Do you think the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the one that raised them? No. He spent most of his nights in a cave. In fact, Khadija had to go all the way up to the cave, give him the food and go back, take care of her trade, and raised the best children ever. She raised the best girl, best female that will exist in Jannah, Fatima. In fact, she was the backbone and the cornerstone of this deen. All right, let's try someone else. Fatima herself, she had 2 children, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein. Who do you think raised them? Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu? He never missed a battle. He was surrounding the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam most of the time. And the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the only hadith that we have reflected him with his grandchildren is when they were playing on his back. So who disciplined those children? To be the greatest teenagers, greatest young men in the history of Islam. I repeat, I think our solution starts by establishing programs to put our sisters and to acknowledge them as the ones that need to raise our children. The alternative is not for them to find a profession. That's where it started to fall apart. When the mother is out of the house most of the time, like her father, and a babysitter is taking care of the rest. Not to mention that babysitter was not told what to teach, but to just sit there and make sure they don't hurt themselves. Our communities are suffering from lack of tarbiyah or murabbi, one that raises and teaches. The best parents think that if we take our children to the masjid, that we have solved the problem. The masjid is a problem. Because the masjid is a man's world. So that our children don't sense that the aura of someone that should raise them in the masjid. So they tend to not like it. We can read into the systems a lot, and I'm sure there's many symptoms that we don't even know. I think it's time for us to really go back to the seerah, go back to the sunnah, study psychology, and see who has the most important figure, the most influential, that can remedy these situations. My opinion is it's the mother. It's the mother. When the Western world convinced us to take the mother out of her parenting responsibility, and sometimes we might say, well, Muslim families still have the mother at home. She's still a housewife. No, she's a TV wife. She's consumed with her own social media. I mean, what do you call this? That if you need your child to come down from upstairs, you text them instead of have them coming down. When was the last time the mother and her children had a dinner together? You go back to these fundamentals, these things that are called old school, and you will have a perfect, inshallah, family in the future. Look at the Jewish society. Let me finish with this. I have engaged myself with the Jewish society quite a bit. They're today the most successful community that we find. And their youth are the most mannered, well-behaved, highly educated, family-oriented community that we have. The common denominator in all of them, go ask any rabbi, he will say, it's the mother. It's the mother. We felt in the trap of losing that factor. Exactly. Abdulrahman.
Jazakallah, Dr. Abdulhakim. That was very beautiful. Different perspective, mashallah. Both perspectives equally important. Now I ask attendees, it would be nice if you could be more interactive. Actually, we would prefer for you to be interactive. If anybody like to ask any questions, please raise your hands, and inshallah, you will be unmuted, and you can ask the question directly. We have Dr. Suzy, Ismail, and we have Dr. Abdulhakim with us to answer any questions you may have. To the panelists, Dr. Suzy and Dr. Abdulhakim, we have one question. It says, how do we get our boys to the masjid? Whichever one of you like to take that question. How do we get our boys to the masjid?
How do we get the messages to be welcoming for our boys? That's the question. I rephrase the question. How do we make our messages something that our boys would want to come to? Our boys are not rejecting the masjids are rejecting our boys. And not by telling them not to come, it's by not establishing something that will encourage them to come. Kids go to the fitness centers, the gyms, they go to the movies, there's something that calls them to go there. We need our messages to be attractive enough for them to come. Not just salah, but everything else. If we're able to do that, the kids will come themselves, inshallah. I don't want to throw the blame on the kids for this. In fact, I've seen masajids think that the type of programs that our kids need is lectures. Lectures are for people that are ready for it. You got to get them there for them to hear.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Abdulhakim, for your response to that question and also for your talk. I actually want to step away. I mean, my response to that question is simply, understanding when we recognize that the whole world could be a masjid. Essentially, if we incorporate the elements of salah, the adab, the akhlaq in everything that our children do, we can guide them, and rather than thinking about bringing them to the masjid, we can bring the masjid to them in the sense of community that we can build in so many different ways. But with that said, I do want to just kind of chime in on something that Dr. Abdulhakim had talked about. And I think, yes, it's an important topic, and it's, exploring the home and recognizing that the tarbiyah of the child begins when the child is still in the womb. It begins when the husband and the wife are cementing that relationship. And I think that's important. But my phone was blowing up a little bit, I think from some, some attendees who were watching online or through the live stream. And a lot of young women, and a couple from comments from young men as well, questioning, when we talk to our boys and when we continue to perpetuate this feeling or this sense that, yes, it is the mother's responsibility to raise the children, which we know without a doubt. And I know Dr. Abdulhakim was stressing the importance of the role of the mother, but it is the mother that must be at home with the children. We also, to a certain extent, and I believe this is what I was hearing from the comments I was getting, we're almost excusing some of that bad behavior of the fathers. We're almost creating this sense where we're raising our daughters in an environment, this month, March is International Women's Month. And I can't tell you how many panels I've been invited to speak on and how many programs are being put together to encourage our girls to feel empowered, to encourage our girls to feel like they can pursue education. We explain to our girls, the importance of being able to have a presence and to give back to their communities. That doesn't take away from giving back to their homes. But the problem arises when we begin to excuse males or give a perceived excuse to males as it's up to the mother to raise the children. It's up to the mother and the father to raise the children. And in the absence of the mother or the father, it is up to the community. That's an ummah. It is up to all of us to raise our children together. And I know this is not what Dr. Abdulhakim was kind of putting out there, but my fear is that for young people who are still navigating marriage, navigating connections, it sounds sometimes like, well, it's the mother's fault. The mother needs to get her act together. The mother needs to memorize Quran. And I know that's not what Dr. Abdulhakim was saying, but I wanted to clarify it, maybe also just from the female perspective, because, from the female perspective, it's not easy also as we raise our girls and encourage them to seek education and, explain to them the role model of Khadija radiallahu anha and Aisha radiallahu anha and what they gave back to their communities and their societies, for our children to also understand that it takes two, that because the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to his family, because he had that partnership with his spouses, this is why the Khadija radiallahu anha, this is why Aisha radiallahu anha were able to also give back to their communities. So all I want to share with those who are asking the questions and making the comments, yes, without a doubt, the mother's role in the tarbiyah is huge. The tarbiyah of the child begins in the womb of the mother. And so she's already got 9 months ahead of you in terms of connecting with the child, and that goes without saying. But the role of the father cannot be diminished. And we need to stop giving our fathers sometimes that pass of feeling like, well, I provide for my family, I have a roof over their head, I cover education, what more is needed from me? More is needed. More is needed, and it needs to be jointly, especially in situations where a couple is divorced, especially when mothers are feeling like they're doing it alone. So again, not to contradict or anything, I'm confirming everything that Dr. Abdulhakim said, but I wanted to kind of provide the perspective that it can be hard on our mothers as well, who feel torn, who feel like they want to be a part of society, giving back, working maybe outside of the home, but they're not supported by a spouse because the spouse feels like, well, it's your job, it's your role. That's not the sunnah of the Rasul either.
I agree with you, Sister Suzy, but that's not also what I meant. But I still emphasize that fathers and mothers are both equipped with different skill sets. those skill sets, if they're not put in their place, then the outcome would not be as it should. The father does not have, that's not an excuse for the father. Fathers have to be there, but I'm saying the fathers don't have the skill sets of mothers during the early years of that child's need. That's why I said, Anas bin Malik, his mother, she was there for him until he was at the age of 13 when she gave him to the Rasul. He needed a male perspective after that. And the same examples that I given for the rest. But you leave those children to the father at a younger age, he's just going to be, as a general in an army, those kids are never going to function well. They're going to be depressed. Let me give you just an example of what I have in my house. And by the way, my daughters, they all went to school. My second daughter is in med school. But that doesn't mean that they leave their home. They're still responsible for their kids. One of my daughters, I wanted to bring her to live with me. She didn't want to. Don't blame her, because I don't have that skill set when she was 5, 6 to help her out. And now there's a different issue. The concept is, Dr. Suzy and everyone that's out there, it's not a male or female, father or mother debate of fights. Well, if we asked the mother to be more attentive to her children at their early age, that means we're stripping her away from her opportunity to go to school and to become a successful businesswoman or professional in her fields. We're saying that if she's not there at that early age, the father can never make up for the absence of her. Just like if he's absent, the mother can never make up for the needs of that child at the age of 10 and above. We complete each other, but one can do a better job at one stage of a child than the other one can. And then that one comes, it does a better job than the other. But that doesn't mean completely, segregating the fathers and the mothers from each other. I know it's sensitive for every time an imam or a sheikh talks about this, sister jump up like we're just being feminists. That's crazy. That is not true. I said in my talk that Khadija went back to take care of her business. So she was a businesswoman at the same time.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a question. Can I go ahead?
Yes, Dr. Zad, please.
Assalamu alaikum. For both Dr. Abdulhakim and Sister Suzy Ismail, I've been to many of these lectures over the decades, and it's like a merry-go-round, with due apologies, but some people put most of the blame either on the parents or the youth or the mosques. From having lived in this country for almost 35 years, what I find is that the youth, especially in this country, more so than in the Eastern countries, that these youth want instant gratification, whatever they do. Our masajid and the Islam that we know or that we practice does not provide instant gratification. It gives you some happiness, like a candle that goes on the whole night, compared to what they need is like lightning and instant gratification. So what can we concentrate on providing something within the realm of Islam in our mosques or in our areas around the mosque, where we can give them a little shot of some kind of instant gratification that will attract them to the mosque, instead of going round and round and round. We've been going for decades that the blame is the parents or the youth themselves or the mosque. So I think at least part of the solution may lie if somebody can come up with some kind of a within the realm of Islam where these youth can get some kind of instant gratification, and that'll sort of motivate them to come to the mosque. That Dr. Abdulhakim mentioned that they like going to the gym and the movies and this and that, but those are instant gratification that they get for 3 hours in a movie. After that, they want something else. They want something else. So it's not, and we are not doing that in the mosque. And I think to a certain degree, We cannot do that within Islam. So is there any idea, something if we think outside the box? What can we do that is halal and yet gives them instant gratification so that it motivates them to come to the masajid? Jazakallah.
Okay, so Dr. Abdulhakim, I saw you unmute and then I saw you mute again. So I guess I'll give a little bit of a response and then you're welcome to jump in at that point. Dr. Zak, I appreciate your question, and I definitely hear where you're coming from. But perpetuating the culture of instant gratification is not going to help our youth. And that slow burn, that candle that you described, that's actually where we want them to be, because life isn't about instant gratification. And the individualism that we've fostered, and again, I don't think it's a blame game. It's not about blaming parents. It's not about blaming our youth. It is about looking to, again, I look at this from the counseling perspective. So for me, I look at systems. I look at what are the factors that contribute to what is happening, and the external factors that we have some element of control over, that we may be able to change and affect. So we want our children to reach that stage where they appreciate the slow candle. We don't want to perpetuate the instant gratification. We don't want to perpetuate that feeling of, you watch a movie for 3 hours, you feel good, and so I'm going to go to the masjid to get that same high of watching a movie. No, I think it's about developing a sense of contentment. And that sense of contentment is actually linked to having a greater sense of collectivism. And this is why we're seeing, particularly in the West, greater push for instant gratification, because of the perpetuation of individualism. The more individualistic a person, becomes, or the path they follow, the more likely they are to seek the instant gratification, and it's all about me. And this is where, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he wept once, and the Sahaba asked him, for what does he weep? He said, for the day when his ummah will say nafsi, 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 instead of ummati, ummati, ummati. This is where we are today, where there's a lot of nafsi. So rather than trying to play into the individualism with instant gratification, let's work on ways to build greater collectivism. Because when our children feel like they are anchored to something bigger than themselves, that's when they begin to recognize that what that slow burn is like, the candle, and the sweetness of the scent as it, moves in that direction. Now, from a practical standpoint, how do we do that? So developing contentment comes, again, I have to give the counseling perspective since that's what I do. A lot of it comes from, self-identity, self-esteem, and self-valuation. We've lost sight of how to give that to our children in our homes, in our schools, in our masajid, in the television shows, in the music, particularly for our boys. And that's what I want to emphasize, because we are seeing indicators that female self-esteem is rising, even though for years we said it was decreasing because of social media. But we are now seeing a shift where female self-esteem is increasing in adolescence and male self-esteem is greatly decreasing. So what we're seeing then is a loss of a sense of contentment, and we're losing it through collectivism. Let's begin by creating, moments, by creating elements within the masjid. We talked about, basketball courts, kinesthetic learning, right? Movement. We know that our boys, and this is, studies show our boys need movement, even if they're fighting against it now because they want to be on the video game. But with the video game, they're also feeling as if they're moving. There's a virtual movement. Let's put a basketball court in the parking lot of MCGP. You guys may have one already, I'm not sure, but let's do it if we don't have one. Let's create spaces that can foster movement for our children, so that when the children have Sunday school, they know that the first hour before Sunday school, they're going to play a basketball game with, with the imam. They know that after the basketball game, then they're going to learn a little bit of Quran, a little bit of Sirah. Then for lunch, they're going to run races. Let's incorporate what meets the needs of our children, and let's increase self-esteem and self-valuation. Let's also introduce counseling, because that has shown to be able to impact that push away from instant gratification. A lot of it is linked to the internal self-talk and how a child sees themselves. And when we can improve that, we can step away from instant gratification. So let's not play into what movies and games and things are giving, because we want to be the alternative to that. And we can be in a way that meets our children's needs, inshallah.
I agree with what Dr. Suzy said completely. And I think she also mentioned, that self-esteem and identity. That's exactly what I was talking about in my talk. That self-esteem and identity starts at an early age. It's when you formulate character, it doesn't happen after the fact of problems. It needs to be before the problems actually occur. And the only time children don't have yet their problems as much as we see today is at those early years at home. Once they're exposed to outside, then they're vulnerable. And then we have a problem. And but I agree with everything that you said. Thank you.
Jazakallah, Dr. Suzy. Jazakallah, Dr. Abdulhakim. That was great. If anybody would like to ask any questions and you want to be anonymous, you're welcome to type it in the Q&A window. Otherwise, we encourage that you raise hand and you will be unmuted so you can ask a question directly to the panelists.
This is Zach Mania. Can I ask another question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, if nobody else is in the line. So question for both Sister Suzy Ismail and Dr. Abdulhakim. What I was thinking was, is there any way right next to our mosque or in our multi-purpose hall to attract the kids? We have decent movies. So on a weekend, they come and watch those movies instead of hanging out elsewhere. And I know there's a big divide in that. Many people are absolutely against it. I can thinking outside the box to keep our youth within the premises. It may not be a bad idea. So is that something that's absolutely forbidden in Islam? Or it's something that is in the gray zone that we could at least think about at some point in time in the future to keep our youth within the fold of Islam and our masjid? So if any comments on that. Sorry, I'm asking too many questions, but.
Dr. Abdulhakim, did you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. Look, when we talk about halal and haram, I'm not a fan of a general answer. Everything initially is halal until we see in the specific act that it contradicts with that normality of halal, and then we say it might be haram. So to have activities in the masjid, I believe every activity is permissible until that specific activity becomes questioned. And then we can answer that. So to answer a general rule of is it permissible to say it's halal, I fear that if we just say halal and haram in general like that, it would create an unfortunate situations later when we get to the details. So when you want to do an act, when you want to do some kind of activity, in general, start from that perspective, everything is halal. And the burden is on someone to come and say that it's haram because of so-and-so. So if you intend to show a movie in the masjid, the movie does not have any kind of ethical problems, doesn't engage the two genders in a way that Islam does not allow, does not have foul language. It helps and promotes good values. I don't see a problem with that. Now I know there are some folks that have issues with pictures and stuff and all that. The rules of Islam are not categorized where you're at, so it's okay here, but it's wrong here in these aspects. So those who think that it's wrong to have that in the masjid, it's equally as wrong to have it at home. These are tools. We should use these tools to make a difference. But I caution myself and everyone else to give a general rule. We'll need to deal with this. لكل مقام مقال.
So I just opened up the Q&A box and I'm seeing a lot of good questions and comments there, and I think that's they're important to address as well. But I actually want to address one that came up in the answered box, and it was a question where someone was asking whether or not we were talking about Muslims And I think, you know, in talking about pornography, talking about gender nonconformity, talking about issues of sexuality, for many of us, we're kind of still in our safe box thinking, not us. This isn't our community. This doesn't have to do with Muslim boys. You know, why are you bringing in a non-Muslim author? It really does. You know, if we are to look at the number of male clients that we see, adolescent male clients across just our offices in New Jersey, I'm not even going to talk about our offices in London and Australia and Canada, but our cornerstone offices in New Jersey alone, our 5 offices, on a weekly basis, we see consistently anywhere between 7 to 8 new male clients that are struggling with their sexuality and that are identifying as part of the LGBTQ community. These are new clients, and this is just in New Jersey. We see consistently approximately 2 to 3 new male adolescent clients that are struggling with suicide ideation, self-harm, or harm towards others. We see consistently multiple cases of marijuana usage, drug addictions, opioid addictions. This is our Muslim community. These are our Muslim boys. These are our Muslim youth, and we have to stop thinking that it doesn't touch us, because all of the things that we talked about earlier, you know, we're so quick to dismiss it as like, oh, this is some psychological mumbo jumbo that, you know, doesn't affect my kids. Oh, it does. It does. And we as Muslim families need to wake up and realize the number of, you know, messages, text messages that I'll receive after, you know, when I give a lecture or a program, I'll always share my direct cell phone number with the teams that are there. And the number of late night messages that I get, text messages with questions that are so heartbreaking that these children can't talk to their parents about, it's there. And we have to start opening our eyes and realizing that we need to educate ourselves from a secular perspective about what's out there, as well as from the Islamic perspective, because that's what our children are facing. And, you know, with that, I'm going to take just one question from the Q&A box, and I'm going to let Dr. Abdulhakim answer some of them as well. But there is a really good question here that says, what words do you have for all the young boys watching? And I had mentioned earlier in my talk that, you know, when people had asked me, oh, you know, can my boys attend this? I said, yes, let them attend it, because if there's anything that's going to sit you down as a family, even if we're talking to parents, let your children see that you as parents are seeking answers and asking questions and wanting to learn to be the best parent that you can be. But for the boys that are watching, first of all, taking that time to watch a lecture and a program with your parents, you deserve, you know, a commendation for that, because I know there are other things that you might want to be doing. But also know that you are valued, that you are worth being a young Muslim American teen, a young Muslim American male, that you have your place, not just in our deen, you have your place in our society, you have your place in your family, and you don't need to conform to the roles that you may be seeing pushed at you by books and movies and video games. We have our role model, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to follow in his footsteps, male or female. That's our goal, to be able to have that perfection of character and adab. And so for the boys who are watching, look for the role models, even if you can't find it in your own household sometimes. We know that, you know, as human beings, none of us are perfect, but the perfection lies in our deen. So look for that and you know, ask questions and don't be afraid and reach out. You know, you're not alone, and you don't have to find all your answers from the internet. You know, there are people who love you, who care about you, who want what's best for you. Don't retreat into an angry shell and find your seclusion that way. You know, it's okay to reach out.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Suzy. I want to echo her first answer. I've worked with youth over the years. I have seen things that really tear our hearts apart. Many families don't understand the extent of how American or Western we are. You know, I grew up here. I grew up in Detroit. But in our days, when we grew up, we had an extremely closed, conservative household, and there was not much where I can go and get lost within a culture that's probably not ours, as my dad used to say. But I still was able to have access. Imagine today, our children don't carry that same thinking that our fathers had coming to this country. They're Americans. They have the same challenges as any typical American out there, and some. because also they have that challenge with their parents that want to let them feel that they are not totally Americans, that they're looking down at them. And our children think that our culture looks down at them, while they look down at our culture too. So there's a lot of challenges. And Dr. Suzy mentioned homosexuality. Yes, it's in our community. We have gender relations that conflict with our values. It's in our community. Everything that you see in a non-Muslim community, it's really within our community, almost in the same numbers. It's just more quiet or more unknown because we don't understand how to monitor our children. Let me just give you one statistic that I did a few years ago. I sat with about 80 youth, and I asked them a few questions anonymously. Those 3 questions were: 1, do you see yourself a Muslim? 2, do you have a relationship with an opposite gender? 3, do you like the type of food you eat at home? Third question was a little kind of weird, but I wanted to know if they actually respect the culture. The first question, out of the 80 kids, and they're all from the age of 13 to 17. Out of the 80 kids, I had 17 of them said they don't see themselves Muslims. About, I think it was 8, said they're not sure. And the rest, they said, yes, of course I'm a Muslim. You do the math, what's the percentage? 8 plus 17, that's 25 out of 80. 17, no. 8, they're not sure. The second question, do they have a relationship with the opposite gender? Out of the 80 that answered, 63 said yes. 63. I wonder if any of the parents know that. And then the last question, do you like the food at home? Astonishingly, over 30 of them said no. One would assume your mother makes the best food, but they don't see it that way. They resent some of the things that we share with them as our culture. Let's stop sharing culture and start sharing faith. If we start sharing faith with them, maybe it would work better than trying to force a culture on them. One of the individuals asked, I'm a single mother, no male role models around. What can I do? Find a mentor. There's a lot of folks out there. There's programs out there that can offer a mentor. I remember growing up, we used to have pen pals. That was such an amazing program, as having a pen pal. I know there's a Maghrib Institute. They have now started a mentor program where the shuyukh that teach at the Maghrib, they will offer what they called a brotherhood small group. So each one of them is going to take 9 to 10, 8 teenagers and befriend them. They say, they talk on the phone as friends. They share hobbies. They talk about movies. They talk about different things. It's a very wonderful program Al Maghrib Institute is doing. Get in touch with these, like Al Qalam Maghrib, not necessarily to sit there for lectures, but these shuyukh can be mentors, and they have, our youth respects them. I mean, people, when they hear, for example, a name like Yasir Al-Qadhi, they get excited about that name because they see these individuals born and raised here. They have internal respect for them more if you sent them to, with full respect, for example, to a sheikh that came from the Middle East.
So if I can answer this one, I do think it's an important one. It's a question that asks, the spouse is saying, the wife is saying that her husband is always asking her, if you want to switch places, do you want to work 60 hours a week and I'll stay home with the kids? And this is a common one that we see in marriage counseling, when couples feel like, I do more, no, you do more, no, you don't do your share, and my job is so hard. And it's something that we often hear in terms of a comparison. And I think it goes back to that sense of partnership, that, how do you build a partnership with your spouse, and how do you build a connection so that both of you recognize your role within the family? And the question that's being asked is, what's the social role of the father beyond supporting the family financially, so that children can see what it means to be a man? And how can the dads be more protectors of their children and more vigilant? So part of what we're seeing as the problem in our society today is that, yes, we are encouraging both men and women to be educated. Yes, we are encouraging them both to, contribute to communities and societies. But unfortunately, when you enter into the workplace, we know that here in the West, there is no such thing as work-life balance. There's not only an expectation of 60 hours a week. Right now with work from home, it's like you're expected to be accessible for work, 18, 19, even 20 hours a day. We're not even talking about a week anymore. So that concept of work-life balance doesn't really exist as much as it should here in the Western world. And because of that, we're constantly struggling to catch up and to keep up. So what can a father do? It does start with time, and it does start with carving out time. So if you know that your weekend is untouchable, for example, make your weekend untouchable, and make sure that that Saturday, as a father, you are taking the children out for breakfast even. And even if they're still at age 4 or 5 or 6, I have to be honest, alhamdulillah, when I was, working on my PhD and I was, traveling a bit and writing books, my children were very young. And my husband, alhamdulillah, was the one who did an amazing job in being there for them. That doesn't mean that I wasn't there for them. It means that we found a balance and a partnership. And, I often mention this, in my talks when I'm traveling to different campuses. Whenever I travel to the big conferences and I'm speaking at them, so many times people will come up to me and ask and say, oh, it's so nice that you're traveling, but who's taking care of your kids? And my response is always like, their father, and I have never, and I don't know, Dr. Abdulhakim, maybe you've been asked this question, but I have yet to hear a male scholar or speaker being asked that question as well. It's so nice that you can travel. Who's taking care of your kids? And until we start shifting and realizing that the taking care of kids, the raising children, is a mother and father job, and it's a job that we do together and that we find pathways to, there's always going to be this, my job is harder, no, your job is harder. So what the father can do if he is working a lot of hours, and what the mother can do if she's working a lot of hours, carve out that time, make that space, create those avenues of connection. When I remember my oldest, who is now, she's 20 now, and I've got 2 in college and a middle schooler. But I remember when she was a baby and I used to lecture at Rutgers University, I was teaching there, I would take her in her car seat and I would hide her behind the lectern in the lecture hall so I could lecture. She grew up loving the field that I was lecturing in, and that's her major actually. And my husband, the same thing. If I was traveling and he needed to take the children to work, he would take them to work with him. And we were able to find that pathway and that avenue. So it's doable, but it's only doable if it's a partnership. So don't compare who has the harder job. Don't compare, that the father's outside of the home, so he's not expected to be a role model in the home. No, both mother and father need to be the role models in the home. Both mother and father need to work together. It's not easy, and this is why there is so much reward for raising children, raising righteous children, but you do it together, and don't feel like it's one person's role to be present in the children's life. Your children need both of you. And if there is a situation of divorce, you need to build that village and have that support around you from all different avenues.
There's a question, I believe, I was told, what can we do to protect the kids' fitra? My husband always says, my son is a mama's boy. He is 3. What else would he be? Actually, yeah, what else is he going to be? There's a hadith that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. Every born child is born according to al-fitra. Fitra is the purity of what a human being is supposed to be, whether it is within their aqidah, within their manners, within their feelings and their vision of the world. Everyone is created with that perfect concept, which is the fitrah. But listen to this, and this informs what Dr. Suzy says. فَأَبَوَاهُ. He didn't say his mother or his father. He said فَأَبَوَاهُ, both parents. يَهَوِدَانِهِ أَوْ يُنَصِّرَانِ. They're the ones that change him, change his fitrah, change his purity, his innocence at the beginning. So yes, at the age of 3, he is his mother's son. He's also his father's son. At that time, they do take care of them. I just want to tell this mother that you just need to remember Jannah is under your feet anyway. So the father can never claim that. The path to Jannah will always go through both, but more so through the mother, because I always felt like mothers care more. Fathers have failed so many times. Mothers care more. But abawahu yahwidanihi wa yunasrani. Both parents. Both parents. Divorce is not an excuse either. There was a question that says it takes a village to raise a child. That is so true. We miss that in this in the West. And that's why we have to create communities. I don't know if any one of you have been to Detroit or Dearborn. That's the community I grew up in. That community is mainly a Yemeni community. And children that are born here, Yemenis, they're born here by cousins and stuff. Amazingly, their first language is still Arabic. And I'm talking about 3rd generation, 4th generation. The masjid is jam-packed with youth. They meet every week together in a way like they do back home. They have an environment that created a village that raises all the children. That if the children are outside playing and one of them does something wrong, the neighbor tells them, "Aib alayk. Intabin fulan. Don't do that. Your father is so-and-so, mother is so-and-so." Yeah, I was in Dallas for 17 years, and I started seeing this now in Irving and in Richardson. What changed in Irving and Richardson? The community lives around the masjid. They created a society. I think in the future, we'll have to think about that. The masjid should not be 10 miles away. We should all exist in 1 mile radius and find ourselves, inshallah. Our families sit and meet with each other. Our children play and find friends of their own that they can feel comfortable with. And you can establish programs for a whole neighborhood, not just necessarily a family or two. If you go to Orange County, near Masjid al-Faruq, they created that small community too. Their children are different. I mean, I think maybe Dr. Suzy and her group can do a study of that. Why is the kids in, for example, Dearborn and Hamtramck differ from kids, for example, in Ann Arbor, even though the masjid in Ann Arbor is more active? The masjid in Canton is more active. Why is Irving and Richardson are successful with their kids, even though Masjid Dar al-Iman in Arlington is 10 times more active, but the kids here are better? I don't know. Maybe this could be a study. Maybe someone can do a master's degree or something like that.
So I think last time I was in Dearborn, I went to the Yemeni coffee shop right before the pandemic, actually last March. And what I saw, and it's got to be that. If we open a Yemeni coffee shop here, maybe that'll gather the youth, because that's where all the youth were hanging out. So Allah Alam, maybe it's having those spaces and those places, as we were saying, bringing the masjid to our boys rather than expecting our boys to come to the masjid. And it was beautiful. I remember when I went to the coffee shop and we first entered, and there was someone that was like reciting Quran in the corner, and then there was, after he finished reciting Quran and everybody was silent and respectful, then they were talking, and it was an incredible atmosphere. So maybe that's what we need to do, inshallah.
I'll open one if you come. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallah fiki, Dr. Suzy. It's an honor to share this hour and a half with you. May Allah bless you.
Jazakallah, Dr. Abdulhakim. Jazakallah, Dr. Suzy. MashaAllah, it was extremely informative. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And now I ask Dr. Abdulhakim to please kindly, if you can make the dua, closing dua.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. May Allah bless all of you for joining us tonight. May this hour and a half be written in our good deeds, inshallah. May Allah Ta'ala bless Dr. Suzy and her family and her daughter and her pursuit of education and everyone else. May we do this more often, and I look forward to seeing our families better, inshallah. Jazakumullah.
Assalamu alaikum.